Fantastic. So, this paper about sensory approaches to epigraphy has been inspired both by my research on cognitive approaches, my experience as a university lecturer for 15 years, and now more recently by the fact that I have two children doing A-level and GCSE topics in Asian history in school. So I've had the remarkable ability to see this from a whole bunch of different levels. And perspectives. And one thing that I've really seen is some limitations to the GCSE ancient history approach is that a lot of the materials can be somewhat male-centric. I think the approach is often quite based on literature, and particularly for some of the early Roman history, the cases where women are involved are really involve like acts of sexual violence and death. And so how do we kind of approach these things in a sensitive way, in a way that engages people on a number of senses, that kind of takes us beyond a merely literary text-based approach? And also, how can we make this kind of more inclusive and accessible to broader audiences, particularly to neurodiverse students and people who are interested in history, but not only just reading literary accounts, but kind of art and archaeology. And so kind of more approaches to that. So I've just taken a few examples to show how I would go about doing this. And with this opening slide, what I've kind of tried to show is how we get from these sources that we're using, like source books like Lactor, that are, again, very text-based, and that also kind of don't provide our students with the background information about the different experiences people had. The experience of reading a papyri is very different to reading a monument or a metal object. So it's about kind of taking that materiality and bringing it into how we teach these materials. So I'm going to look at a few of the different periods that get covered in the GCSE Roman history. So early Rome, the Republic, and the early Empire. Obviously, I can't profess to be an expert at all of these, but I hope to at least provide some insights to these. So the first thing I wanted to look at was the rape of the Sabine women. Challenges that I noticed, particularly when my son was learning this, are that we have very little contemporary primary evidence for people to connect with. And sometimes I find if you can start from a sensory perspective, people are more interested and more engaged in the text. And my son, when he was learning this, he just kind of didn't have a broader picture of what this event was. So I want to step behind that, but I also want to look at how can we look at things like rape and violence to women in a slightly more rounded, kind of sensitive manner. That also connects with what they're learning in other classes and courses. So one thing that I would kind of bring in is this stone that's often referred to as the lapis niger. That's actually the black flowing around it, but it's an inscription that is actually from this time. So it gets people to think about what writing in the actual period looked like, as opposed to a literary account that was written more than a millennium later. It also connects with the Sabine women because one of the theories is that it marks the spot where the father of Attila Hostilius died, Hostus Hostilius. So it does actually connect with the event after the rape of the Sabine woman when they attacked the city. This apparently could mark the spot where he fell. But what we also want to do is kind of teach them these critical analytical abilities with these sources. They're not just kind of all of them have an agenda. What are other possibilities? So I think inscriptions are a really good way to kind of give a sensory context. So you can start by looking at where this is. So this is a map of the Republic, and you can see that the green arrow shows kind of where this was, right in the middle of the Forum Romanum. So again, give them a picture, a map, an idea of context. And then we can kind of see, so modern visitors to the site can't actually get into this. This is consistently kind of marked off, but it also gives you a sense of the stratigraphy of the archaeology. So this inscription is still there, it's in situ, and it's below the ground there. So also giving people a sense that, as we go through history, there are layers upon layers. And then finally, the inscription itself. When I first learned Latin epigraphy, this was the first inscription that I was given. And that I think the teacher did it to kind of drive me crazy because it's almost impossible to read. So one other issue with inscriptions is that we can imagine that writing in Rome looked the same all the time. But when we go back to this monument that's actually from the period, we see how this writing looks like it's some of the letters, look more Greek than they look Latin. It's also, if you look at the eras, it's written bistrophodon, up and down. So then what it also gives us is this idea that writing in this context, was it even meant to be read? How would you read this kind of trapezoidal thing? So it's a mystery, and it also just is a way to illustrate the students the difficulties with the evidence that we're working with. Even before we look at the text, it gives them something material. It allows them to use abilities in judging, visuality and space perception and context that they already have. And then reminds them that a lot of Roman readers couldn't have read this anyway. So it's a way to kind of make this evidence a bit more friendly. Now, as you actually look at the text, you get a couple words like sacrum, you get the word that they think might be king. So that does kind of connect us into this idea, is this somehow related to the early kingly period? But you also get the word calator for a public servant, and a word for like a kind of beast of burden. So what we realize is that here we have this inscription that actually dates from the time. We don't know what it said. There is a tendency of historians to take this information and kind of say, oh, well, it must corroborate what we know about the early kings. But the other possibility is that this is a marker of a sacred space, and that what it's actually telling people, talking to public servants and about beasts of burden, is that they must not let their animals defecate in a public space. And we actually have a lot of inscriptions that, later inscriptions that corroborate these kind of markers. So it's a way to present this time and this period, but also the challenges and the difficulties, kind of giving students a broader perspective, of looking at monuments. So another way to do that is also to look at other images we have that are again later. So the 1st century BC coins of the Sabine women, that again, you can talk about the imagery, look at the way these women are depicted, and also why are people choosing to depict this event later on in history. And then the second coin here represents Tarpeia, the Vestal Virgin, and how she kind of sold out the Romans by letting the Sabines into the city because they bribed her with gold. So it's a way to look at the kind of different roles of women and the representations of women, but also to try and put them in their context, to think, why are people looking at these images now? And in the case of the denarius from Augustus, showing Tarpeia, and her, she's almost covered in shields, is also a way to show a rejection of luxury, and very much including women, because he wants his wife Livia involved. So we can also potentially use these sources to tie up with other periods in history that again will kind of help us cement information by coming back to it. Other things we can do are look at things like this mosaic, which shows the rape of Europa. And this is kind of fascinating in that it also shows different perspectives on things like rape and what rape means, and how we need to kind of look at these terms and consider a bit more carefully how they're used. So other things we can do are look at modern receptions of art. I'm not going to look at all of these, but these are an opportunity to present the classics as not just something of one time, but that has later receptions, and to get students who are interested in more material evidence like visual culture involved. For example, when we look at Poussin's version down here with Hercilia famously putting her arms out, this is produced at the time of the French Revolution. And so there's a connection between that particular event and the role of a woman standing out in society, and that image. And then Picasso's image of the Sabine women is written in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's fear of violence, but also fear of nuclear annihilation. And this is a way to kind of make these events accessible, relatable to kind of more modern events and a more modern stream of history. So that's kind of one example of that process. This next one is looking at the Punic Wars a bit, and at Fabius Maximus and Cornelia. And I should say my discussion of the Cornelia base here was inspired by a brilliant paper by Athena Mitropoulos at the CA this year about using this base. So I've kind of tried to take it perhaps even one step further with archaeology, but she deserves a lot of the credit for this idea. So I know this inscription is used in the GCSE syllabus on Quintus Fabius Maximus. What I want to use it to call out a few things, both how we look at literature and how we look at monuments. So we look at this and it's a beautiful marble inscription. The letters are covered in red, and we give students an idea that this is what the inscriptions look like. This is a monument. Nowhere in the sources have I seen have people kind of also said, but this was inscribed hundreds of years later. And that is also a factor in what it says. So in the text, it says here that when Minucius was made a master of the horse, power equal to that of the dictator by the people's wish. Now, this is a really important point in terms of understanding these constitutional roles. What is the role of a dictator? And if the dictator can kind of take someone who is, I don't want to call him a crony, but have an official who carries out his work for him, does that person necessarily have the same power as a dictator? This is one of the kind of key crucial points. And in this inscription, it says that he had power equal to the dictator, but that he wasn't a dictator. So what I would add to that discussion is this inscription from 217 BC that's actually written at the time, a year before Minucius was killed. And it is a dedication to Hercules from Minucius. And this actually says he is a dictator. So a source from the actual time contradicts that later source. But also fascinating is the materiality of the object. So I've got one thing you can do too is like a cheap, rock kit that you get online for a tenner at Amazon has little pieces of these rocks. Sensory approaches, we can bring these rocks in, have students handle a piece of marble, have them handle a piece of tufa, and think about what Rome looked like in the in 217 BCE. It was these kind of difficult stones. Look at how different the letters are, the spellings are, and then think if it's a completely different material, if the message of the text is different, if the spellings are different, to what extent does this later inscription represent different values at the time? So we can use these kind of sensory experiences to also question what's embedded in the text. Another example is this text from Aemilius Paulus from 189 BC. And again, look at the spelling of imperator. This Latin language that we're taught is, hundreds of years after this writing. And then in particular, this bit at the bottom of the military tablet has the phrase SPQR, but the order of the phrase is different. It's not the Senate and the people, it's the people and the Senate of Rome. So it's also a way to get students to really think about how what they're reading sometimes is a subsequent rewrite of history and how that shapes the way that we approach history and spelling. And it's also a way to remind them that the ancients didn't always read, they didn't always get spelling right. And so maybe their errors are, they can be more comfortable with the fact that they too aren't perfect individuals. So in the case of Cornelia, what I've also tried to look at are, so here are some basic facts. She's the daughter of Scipio Africanus. She's the mother of Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. She turned down marriage to Ptolemy VIII to educate her sons, and she's notorious for her modest dress. So she's the antithesis to a figure like Tarpeia. So it also allows us to connect different female figures. In fact, when Pliny describes her statue in his Natural History, he remarks upon the fact how she's not wearing sandals. Even her, or even her sandals didn't have straps. So she was like at the low flip-flop end of the sandals. So even her shoes were not ornate. What's fascinating with the inscription of her is that most inscriptions of a woman talk about her husband, and her husband's completely excluded from this text, though Tiberius Sempronius was an important individual. And we also can connect her to literary fragments, although there's a bit of a debate about whether or not the fragments in Cornelius Nepos connect to her. But she's a woman who we can dig into a bit more and provide a bit more learning for. So here is the actual base. And you can see in this picture with us shining, we're using raking light because the lighting in the museum in Rome isn't great. And when you put light on it, what you can see, what this red arrow is pointing to, these are all scratch marks. So when we look at this base, an inscription that was on this base has been cut off. So it also teaches us kind of that these objects and materials are reused. Also, when we look at the lettering of this is not like the lettering that we've seen in the other monuments. This is an Augustan reworking of this monument. So by looking at the base too, we also see how big it is. So then we can kind of imagine what it looked like. There are different kind of Pudicitia figures and statues. So here's a statue of Livia that we could imagine as a similar type image onto the base. So we can start to kind of bring the base into life and imagine it. When we look at the context of the base, it becomes even more interesting because it was found in the Porticus Octavia. So what's fascinating here is that then the context of her is in a porticus that's designed to display other Roman women in history, connecting her with Augustus's sister. And this is probably why the lettering on it is Augustan, because this is Augustus's sister who also produced Marcellus, whose theater is just nearby, who was an heir to Augustus. It also is how we can see how she was visually connected with Roman history, with the buildings, with the imagery. And then we start to get an understanding of how Augustus used subsequent figures in history to kind of corroborate his narrative and include women in history. There's also an interesting opportunity here to take things a bit further and see how she was used in modern culture. So in the state of Ohio, with the capital Cincinnati, named after our famous Republican Cincinnatus, the female representation of Ohio is actually Cornelia. And so she's depicted on top of this statue. And that famous quote from Valerius Maximus, where she described, when asked, why are you dressed in such a modest way, she said, well, these are my jewels, and pointed to her two children. So beneath the statue in Ohio are 8 US presidents. When it was dedicated, there were only 5. So they've had to like squish them all together on the monument now. And then what you also have is this epitaph found near Bristol for a figure, or for a slave whose name was Scipio Africanus. So it's also a way to connect with kind of broader events in history, broader genders and races with Roman history. So these are just some ideas of where you could go to engage your students. And what I found is when we start with sensory approaches, students are more interested in the text. So it's not saying, oh, look at the image, forget about the text. It's actually a way to get them to engage with this material in a way that they're comfortable with. So finally, this also takes us into Cleopatra, which is somewhat more difficult. The challenges of this study are really Augustus's subsequent exclusions. And actually, what the other 2 case studies can show us is how subsequent approaches tend to redraft and rewrite a narrative. So by the time you get to Cleopatra, this may already be something that your students are beginning to look for and understand. Another issue is the predominantly Roman nature of the accounts and the narrative, and also kind of modern romanticizing images of Cleopatra. So how do we kind of go about addressing these things? Another point you could also make, that the coin about Tarpeia, minted under Augustus, which was minted, I think, 10 years after Actium. This idea of a very luxuriant woman covered in defeated shields could also be a reference to Cleopatra. So you can actually, what I've tried to do with this case studies is show how you can also actually connect the ideas throughout Roman history and build these skills over time. So one thing I've done is try to look at cases where she's excluded. So we have Augustus's monument to his victory at Actium, and Cleopatra is nowhere in sight. She's not mentioned at all. And there's a deliberate exclusion kind of going on there. What I've also done here is to try and acquaint people, advertise the new Classical Association website with Roman inscriptions that has that is now online that you can access. And this also is promoting sensory approaches to learning. So for example, here's an entry, and it shows you again how we've tried to add physicality, not just have an image of a text, but show a picture of a text, provide a commentary that people read, and then present the text. We've collaborated with Asterion also to kind of help structure and present the language in a way that makes it more accessible for neurodiverse learners. And these blue links are also links to the actual sites and restorations so that students can get a sense of what this inscription actually looked like. And one of these things is actually a video with sound and 3D images where people can actually see the monument. I don't know how much time we have to play it, but it's got like the sounds of seagulls and it comes up to the monument. So it's just kind of, again, trying to bring this point home of how we can take students out of a text-based centrality. So this just gives you, and it gives you an entrance up to the thing. With my screen the way it is, I cannot see the time. So I'm wary of that. So I'm gonna move
about
on.
5 minutes, it's all right.
Yes. All right. So I'm going to move on to the next one. So mostly when we teach Cleopatra, we've got the Dendera relief, which shows her in Egyptian dress. But we don't necessarily think about kind of how she's been excluded or presented in a modern context. So for example, we hear a lot about the obelisks that Augustus brought to Rome, but less attention is paid to what we call Cleopatra's Needles, which one of which is an embankment in London, which you can see. And the question here is, when Augustus rededicated the temple to Caesar in Alexandria, he put these bronze dedications that say he is responsible for moving the obelisks to Alexandria. And people have generally just believed that. But there are a few interesting questions there. One, when Pliny discusses the moving of obelisks, he does not talk about this particular one. But also the ones that have been moved to other places are like disparate monuments from disparate places, whereas the two that were in Alexandria were a pair that were from one place. And interestingly, they're both obelisks that were dedicated by another famous pharaoh, Tutmosis III, whose mother, Hatshepsut, was one of the first female pharaoh figures in all of Egyptian history. So that if Cleopatra was going to pick any obelisks to go out there to connect her with Caesar and her son Caesarion, who wanted to rule, it's quite likely that these would have been the obelisks that she would have picked. So there's a way to look at things and materials that are actually, in this case, one of them is in London, to think about how some of these people might have been excluded from narratives. And also to think about, again, looking at modern art, the difference between depictions, like in Tadima's thing, where, again, Cleopatra is presented, as a kind of very white looking woman with Antony in her thrall, and how they're actually represented on coins, where Cleopatra doesn't look very terribly on Roman, but she definitely looks different. And Catullus's comment about her not short nose is quite evident, but also that they're juxtaposed in an equal position, not as him being in thrall, but as two co-rulers on either sides of a coin. So that's my idea in terms of representing things, the places that we could go with sensory approaches to support these things. I know Jane Ainsworth has also been talking about Roman Britain. Other things you could do are you can buy these kind of wax tablets and have people try and write in them, recreate that experience of writing. But I just think there are so many kind of sensory approaches that we could have that could bring the ancient world back to life, and that can make students who aren't just interested in literature and reading books and texts, to get them to engage and see that their skills and their perspectives matter. And often when someone has thought about the kind of practical constraints of a monument or an object, then they bring more to their interpretation of the text, not less. So also finally, and I'm sure we could send this out, I have a page of links. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, the British Epigraphy Society has tons of epigraphers on their web pages who are happy to come in and give school talks. And certainly I'm happy to come in and try and help promote sensory approaches to inscriptions and getting people to use their eyes and their hands to engage with these materials apart from just reading about them in a book. And also hopefully include women a bit more in our knowledge of history. So I don't know if people have questions or.
Yeah, we have got time. We've got about 2 minutes if anyone would like to ask any questions or raise any comments. Jack.
That was great, thank you. I've got kind of one question and one addition. I'll do the addition first. In terms of making things sensory, just to remind people, the ARLT does have a series of loan boxes that can be requested by teachers for use with, authentic artifacts in them, which I just think is, a great way of achieving what you're talking about. The question is site maps and plans and things like that, like the one you showed in the forum earlier. They're fantastic. I find it a nightmare to find them. So do you have a good kind of go-to place where you can find them that isn't Pinterest? Because I can never verify if they're any good.
I do have to search around for a lot of these, but I can't spout them off right now, but I can provide there are a few digital web-based resources that have a lot of these maps. And if you go to the website, they have a lot, and they're kind of designed to help teachers, like digital urban maps. I know UCal Berkeley created a resource, so there are more of these resources popping up. There's also the what is it? The Ancient Rome Live website. They kind of have some resources, but I agree with you. It can be hard to kind of find and propagate these maps, but I'll have to look them up, but I can find some kind of places to go.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Abigail. Right, I'm going to stop